legislative provision then, the equivalent of 44, was worded in very loose, perhaps permissive terms. It was that to the effect that the Electoral Commission use technology where applicable or as may be appropriate. After the 2007 elections, which then, one of which was that we must employ, or we should employ the use of technology in our elections. When we got to the 2013 general elections, there was a good attempt at using technology, but the various forms of technology that were used were not were in different platforms. So that there was a different platform for purposes of registration, a different platform for purposes of identification, and a different platform for purposes of transmission. That did not work very well, perhaps because of the inefficiency attendant to the system. Then came the amendments in 2011 to Section 44, which required then that the technology to be employed was one to be integrated, meaning that in that one solution, we had the solution, we had the option for voter registration, which is biometrics. The second was electronic identification of voters and electronic transmission of results. Now, the question that we have before you today is whether, as conceptualized, that solution then meets the constitutional imperatives under Article 86 of integrity, verifiability, security, transparency, and accuracy. I will take a moment to just demonstrate how each of these could have been achieved. But when you retire, though, to consider the decision, I would invite your attention to specific affidavit of Michael Ohuma, who sets out in a very granular sense how these imperatives were met. I then would want to talk, that is specifically paragraph 39 to 49 of the affidavit of Michael Ohuma. I then would want to talk a bit to the process entailed in those three items. And I'm sure we are most of us are familiar, those of us who have participated in elections are familiar with that process. That once the voting has been done and the polling station has been converted for to the evening now for purposes of tallying and counting of results, we start by the counting in a very transparent manner. The presiding officers count each and every ballot, and I'm sure we've witnessed this, showing a vote for Gumbo, a vote for so-and-so, and a vote for so-and-so. Now, at the end of that process, they are then tabulated to give us Form 34A. How then is technology infused in Form 34A? Form 34A has internally identified security features. There are 8 in number. We have watermarks, we have we have microtext, among other security features. What is the significance of it? It is so that when somebody looks at 34A, the original, it cannot then be whatever it is that happened at the polling station, authentic representation of the will of the people. What then happens is that after that form has been tabulated, captured with a KIMS device, one copy is sent to the National Tallying Center. Another of that image is sent to the Constituency Tallying Center. And the presiding officer then collects all the, takes the Form 34A for purpose of the collation to the Constituency Tallying Center. That, again, is to achieve the constitutional imperative of verification. When we get to the Constituency Tallying Center, the returning officer has a back-end access to be able to load their 34B and transmit it to the National Tallying Center. Once that is done, they will then go with their Form 34A together together with their bees to the National Tallying Center for purposes of the verification and tallying at the National Tallying Center. Again, it is important to note that by the time the returning officer gets to the National Tallying Center, we have the image that is already in the portal. When they get there with their original form, an opportunity is then presented again for verification, for confirmation of accuracy, and more importantly, that in this election, because of the decision that was rendered by this court in the Raila Odinga decision in 2017, the commission, in reconceptualizing or reconfiguring its electoral architecture, gave a public portal for people to be able to also follow, thereby meeting the constitutional imperative of transparency. It then meant that if I'd gotten my results from my village, my primary school where I vote, I would be able to follow those results all the way to Nairobi and take account and follow if at all there is anything that would have happened or changed. Then I must be the first person to be able to raise that concern. It should also not be lost that in that polling station, we have our agents, we have our observers. Again, to add to the fact of verifiability. So that then is the architecture of what our election pathway looks like. That said, it then must follow that at the polling station, if I am a candidate, I certainly must have interest in the outcome in that particular polling station. Because a copy of the results will be given to me, I then should be able to communicate with my team, perhaps my national agent for a particular candidate, a particular party, to be able to demonstrate that what we got in member primary school and what has been transmitted to the national and the same. And that in the event that there's a discrepancy, it does. Now, as to whether this technology was successful, Michael Ouma deposed in his affidavit that 46,201 KIMS kits deployed throughout the Republic worked out of the 46,229. It then leaves us just with about 200 KIMS kits, which did not work at the opening or start of election on that particular day. I asked myself, if out of 46,000 KIMS kits, only 200 do not work, would I say I've failed? Even in our educational system, an A does not connote 100%. It starts somewhere from 88% going all the way to 100%. The mathematical representation of this gives us more than 99% success rate. In our view, that then achieved the constitutional imperatives that are contemplated under Article 86. Again, for purposes of confirming whether that system is secure, I invite you, my ladies and my lords, to look at paragraphs 51 to 63 of the affidavit of Michael Ouma. Again, just to mention a few items in relation to that, that KIMS gadget works in specific ways. It is first locked to a station, meaning you can then not use it once you've locked it to the events of that day to transmit results from a different station for purposes of that election. That the entire network through which the results are transmitted are or double layered with firewalls, meaning there's the first firewall and the second firewall for purposes of securing that transmission. Very significant again to mention that at the point at which that image is to be transferred, it is encrypted. So as it is transmitted, it is not in the form of what we would imagine the image of Form 34A. If I was to use an example, if it was to be a water pipe and it is to be encrypted, it means if you broke into that water pipe, because we all know that the chemical formula of water is H2O, you'll get your hydrogen on one side, you'll get your oxygen on one side. It then means you'd not be able to make sense of that water that you're looking for. Again, able to relate this with other factors. In the KIMS kit, we have certain information that is resident, close of business in any polling day. One of them is the question as to the voter turnout of a day. It means for somebody to intercept that system, they must have information in relation to the voter turnout of that day. It may not be practical for somebody to say that they have the capacity to know the voter turnout throughout the country at the second at which they want to intercept a particular form transmitted. Again, if we exceed the number of people who voted, then again, from an accountability perspective, it would be very easy to point out to say, because of the fact of this interference, you've exceeded the numbers of what was captured in your report. To give further comfort, this transmission is done over a virtual private network, which is provided by the mobile network operators. So secure that environment to ensure that there is no intrusion or interference coming from any quarter into the system. For a good, perhaps, mental understanding of what this means or how this was applied, Michael Ouma in his affidavit says that there were more than 380 million hits on trying to, just to access the public portal. And that according to him, none of the systems even blinked. That is how secure that environment is. Now, the other question that somebody would want to look at in relation to Article 86 is the compliance with the provisions, statutory provisions in relation to procurement and all those. Again, I invite you, my ladies and my lords, to look at paragraph 64 to 71 of the affidavit of Michael Ouma. He then ends at saying that close of business, more than 14,239 people were successfully identified through that system. He describes it, to use his words, as a military-grade system. That is how comfortable he is with that security features of that system. I come to the second question, which is whether there was interference with uploading and transmission of Forms 34A from the polling stations to the IBC public portal. The details that we have submitted, including the KIMS returns, it will be apparent that there was no such intrusion. But assuming for one moment that we want to interrogate this fact of staging, we then would want to ask ourselves, at what point in time did this happen? Because according to the infrastructure that is laid out by the IEBC, once a form is transmitted from the polling station and it gets to the public portal, it also has certain inbuilt security components. It has a digital signature. That digital signature marks an indication as to the exact time when that form was transmitted. If there's intervention, then certainly there must be a lag between the time when that form was transmitted and the time the form got to the National Tallying Center. It is our submission that nothing has been presented before this court to even come close to making that suggestion. Again, as part of the security that is in the portal, each of the forms that get there are serialized. and the serialization tied to the polling station. It is tied to the time up to the second when that form was received. It then, as an additional property, gives you a tab to be able to confirm or verify whether there's been any alteration on the form from the time it was transmitted. One would then very easily pick up that as a concern to say, we refer you to, again using my primary school in Member Primary School, that the form 34A that was sent from Member Primary School was intercepted, manipulated at this point in time. That is a report that the portal would be able to generate. Again, not a single piece of evidence has been given to come close to suggesting this. I've pondered since the submissions and presentations yesterday from hearing for the petitioners as to what really this evidence is. I have, in the course of struggling to look for this evidence, come across three possible areas that we'll be talking about. In the affidavit of one John Mark Gidongo, they make reference to a form 34A from Baringo County, Tiati constituency. They then say that that is an example of a form that was intercepted. Michael Ouma, in his affidavit, confirms that in fact the form that was uploaded or that was attached in the affidavit of John Mark Gidongo is not a form rose from. That according to him, this form was downloaded. Somebody tried to interfere with the details on it and attached it to an affidavit. Now that, if you asked me, is perhaps the silliest way of doing any of these things, because if somebody asked you whether that form was authentic, you only need to look at the public portal. You then need to verify it with the form 34A that was presented. My ladies and my lords, as a statutory requirement, we delivered all the form 34As to this court. We have a copy. The entire public has copies of each and every of those documents. Our team went through those documents, and in relation to that specific form 34A, to say the least, it's a forgery. The second attempt, again by John Gidongo, in his affidavit, to try and present some form of evidence is in the form of logs which were alleged to have been gotten somewhere. It says Karen with these 56 mysterious people, and this I think is what senior counsel Professor Gidi Bigai was talking about. Hearsay on the back of hearsay. I was told that I had. Really, is that the sort of evidence that you want to present before this court? We took time. That is, the ICT team took time to study the logs that were presented. My ladies and my lords, I'm sure you have appropriate infrastructure to be able to make a determination on your own as to what these logs entail.
Just 2 or 3
from the analysis that were conducted, and this is again contained in the affidavit of Martin Nyaga,
if you can, that is in paragraph 30.
These forms, these logs arose potentially or were picked potentially from the 2017 general elections. Martin Nyaga, in his affidavit, identifies 9 obvious inconsistencies. I want to allude to just 2 or 3 of them. That if you, and that is